Harriet Edwards and I'm the Global Director of Regulatory Affairs here at Albumedix. So I oversee the regulatory strategy and ensure our products have appropriate documentation to support our customers. So today I'm going to talk about the regulatory implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and how they may affect future regulation of future vaccines.
Thank you. So starting at a really broad scope, can you give me a brief explanation of the purpose of regulatory authorities in the pharmaceutical industry?
So the regulatory authorities are an independent body that regulate the a safe and effective use of medicines across the board. So they ensure that products are safe, effective and of an appropriate quality for the patients. And then on the flip side of that, they ensure that the information provided to patients is of an appropriate level of detail, but also able to be understood appropriately. Also, they work to strategise with the pharmaceutical industry to ensure that new medicines can be put on the market as quickly as possible, but in a safe and appropriate manner.
Thank you. And how does Albumedix work with the regulatory authorities?
Of course, so Albumedix tends to work in a very collaborative way with the national competent authorities across the globe, and we do that in two ways really. So our products are subject to their own regulatory documentation, which we maintain in-house to ensure that our products are an appropriate quality to support our customers for use in their own applications. And then we support customers directly with their applications as well, so either through regulatory strategy and programme development or answering questions directly related to our products within theirs. Okay, so in terms of further customer-driven support, we do that in a phase-dependent manner, and that's either dependent on what the customer requires at the point in development where they are. So that could be high-level product summaries, or it could be right the way through to our in-depth master files, which are lodged with certain authorities across the world and supports our customers in their applications to reduce the regulatory burden. We also have extensive real-world evidence of the use of our products in customer applications and vaccines. For example, one of our products is in the Merck MMR paediatric vaccine, which has been dosed more than 210 million times across the world in children. And so that real-world safety data really supports the use of our products within the customer applications. Aside from that, we have our dedicated regulatory team in-house, which are composed of regulatory experts, and they're really available for agency meetings to support our customers, responses to questions, regulatory strategising, and also the maintenance of our own regulatory documentation.
For anyone that perhaps doesn't know, could you run us through the clinical development process a vaccine goes through?
Okay, so there are three various stages, broadly speaking, for a vaccine to be developed. That's the same as any other pharmaceutical product and drug as well. So I'm sure people are more familiar with the terms now thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. But generally speaking, products go through phase 1, 2 and 3 development before they're allowed to be commercialised and put onto the market. Phase 1 development is usually the first time that a product is dosed into humans, so that typically involves healthy volunteers and a very small scale study of tens of patients with low doses of the drug to find out what's safe and tolerable rather than what's efficacious. Then, if the product is successful in that phase, it will move forward into phase 2, which is usually the proof of concept studies, where it may or may not involve patients and or healthy volunteers. And the idea of this phase really is to find out whether or not the product works within its target indication. And so if that's successful, we then move on to the large scale phase 3 trials, which are typically multinational, involve thousands of patients across the world, and really work out whether or not this product is efficacious across a wide range of populations. So that could be old, young people, people that may be pregnant or people that have certain immune conditions, as well as the general population for which it's intended to treat. So that's the typical process for a vaccine development. There are obviously things that happen once the product is approved, which is sometimes known as phase 4, and that's real world safety data. So once the product is out into the population, there is still some follow-up required to see whether or not the product is safe and should be continued to be used in the population.
Thank you. And how is this process handled in the context of COVID-19? Is there anything different or particularly challenging?
So the answer is yes to both of those questions. However, it is really important to stress that actually the development of any vaccine has to go through the same phases. So the COVID-19 vaccines are no different. However, what is different is the speed at which they're being developed. So, for example, typical vaccine programs are multiple years long, and they run in a very sequential way, so from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and on to commercialisation. However, the COVID vaccines are very different in the way that they are being sped through the regulatory process. The reason for that is obviously the benefit to patients is greater here. The need for patients to have access to a vaccine in the context of a pandemic means that developers have to balance safety and risk benefit. And obviously the risk to patients not having access to a vaccine is much higher in the challenging environment that is the COVID-19 pandemic, and so things must be expedited much quicker. However, the safety must be checked, and so we can't just skip through the regulatory hurdles. So everything must be checked to ensure that it's safe as well as efficacious. But the way that the development is happening is kind of parallel rather than sequential. So where phase 1 would usually happen first, followed by phase 2 and phase 3, in the context of the COVID vaccine development, these phases are all happening at once, which is very unusual. So it's not uncommon to put phases together. So the late phase 2 and 3 trials may happen together, or the early phase 1 and early phase 2 proof of concepts could be combined. However, to combine phase 1, 2 and 3 is very unusual, and that's something that we are seeing as part of the COVID-19 vaccine development. So that is unusual. Obviously, the speed at which the vaccines are being developed, things are happening in real time for the regulators as well as the developers. And because of that, challenges are arising as they happen, which is quite difficult and unforeseen. So obviously the safety of the development of the COVID vaccines is paramount. However, there are vested interests from the developers to get the first vaccine onto the market, and so there's a real race for the developers to get that title of the first COVID vaccine that's safe and efficacious onto the market and into patients. And because of that, the process is happening very quickly. That places a lot of burden onto the regulators as well as the developers, who have to review all of this information independently, so separate from the government, separate from the pharmaceutical industry, to ensure that the information that's being presented is accurate, is safe and effective, and the product is of an appropriate quality. And so multiple vaccines being developed in real time, very, very quickly, is placing a lot of burden onto the developers and the regulators who need to review all of that information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are there any other factors that help to speed up the vaccine development process?
So obviously the way that the development programs are being run is the main difference to normal vaccine development. However, the way that the regulators are collaborating with the developers is a really big factor in speeding up the process for these vaccine candidates. The way that that's happening is lots of different ways. Actually, it's multifactorial in that the regulators are working very closely with the developers to review data as it's produced, so not waiting for finalised reports and not providing all of the information as one final package, which is the typical way that these products are reviewed and regulated, but instead providing interim reports as soon as safety data is reading out from these trials. The regulators are seeing that and interacting in real time with the developers, so that's helping to speed things up. Also, the way that the regulatory review is presented to the regulators, so the pathways that are being used for the Pfizer vaccine, for example, is going through an emergency use pathway, so that's an expedited pathway for regulatory approval in the US. We have similar things in the UK and elsewhere in the rest of the world as well, and those pathways are being utilised to their full extent in order to help these developers reach the market much quicker.
How do you think the global effort to get a COVID-19 vaccine has affected the future of regulations?
It's a really good question, and it's something we may not know the answer to until further in the future when the vaccines have been successfully developed. However, my personal opinion is that this will bring the regulators and the developers closer and more collaborative to work together in the future. It's quite clear from the efforts of the COVID-19 vaccine development programs that have happened in the last few months, the speed at which the developers and the regulators can work collaboratively together in order to get something onto the market as quickly as possible. And I think that will continue as we are sure to face more pandemics in the future and more urgent requirements for new drugs. So that's one way. Another way, I think, in which the regulators may look at changing things is the need for global alignment. And that's something that's really difficult because the national competent authorities are all governed by their own regulations. And as a result of that, there's always slight differences in terms of regulatory requirements across the globe. Because of that, it does mean that global developers face real big challenges when they're trying to get a product onto the market in multiple territories. And I think this is amplified by the pandemic, where it's affected so many different territories across the world. So the need to have harmonised and aligned regulatory guidance and rules is very clear. And I think that's definitely one thing that the regulators will look at in the future.
We've talked a lot about the expedited approval process, but do you foresee any challenges once these drugs are on the market?
It's a really good question, and I think, yes, there will be lots of challenges once these vaccines are on the market. It's important to say that once any product reaches the market, there are challenges. However, for the COVID-19 vaccines, there are significant ones that we already foresee. The biggest of those being the logistical challenges that these type of vaccine candidates are presenting, particularly the mRNA-based vaccines that need cold chain storage, so minus 70 degrees, makes it really difficult actually to develop that vaccine and be able to distribute that worldwide to the patients that need it. Whereas some of the other vaccines that are able to be stored at room temperature, obviously those logistical challenges are not there. However, there is a challenge for all of the candidates in so much that we don't know the long-term effects of this vaccine. Usually when vaccines are developed, as we've said, it takes a matter of years, and so there are to some extent long-term effects that have been seen throughout the development programme and can be accounted for and planned for. However, until a vaccine gets into the population and has been used for a long time, there really isn't any way of knowing for sure what those long-term effects could be, and that will be something, regardless of what type of vaccine the COVID-19 vaccine development eventually is that's successful, the long-term effects will still be unknown for us some time.